I guess, Ms. Chavez, I'll start with you because you talked a lot about the migration crisis. We agree with that. COVID-19, I mean, all of those things are important. Economic growth. I really do wonder, I guess I want to ask a little bit about, your statement about reinvigorating regional organizations like the OAS and using that and others to bolster democracy in the hemisphere. Isn't part of bolstering democracy, I believe, sort of elevating and those countries that are actually following democratic norms, which, by the way, democratic norms sometimes elect people whose policies we may not like, right? I mean, I certainly don't agree with some of the policy directions that President Obrador has taken in Mexico, but I don't argue that he's a dictator or that he somehow has taken power in that country through means that are illegitimate. I mean, that's a part of the risk here that's just part of the things that happen. And I imagine that there are people elected in this country that our partners in the Western Hemisphere sometimes don't agree with their policies as well. But that's different from having someone who takes power. The real dynamic we've seen now is people that figure out how to win elections, and then once they capture the government or once they're in power, then they begin to undermine all of the institutions in that society or bend them to their will. The favorite is always the infamous, the generic electoral commission that suddenly is, filled with all of your buddies and cronies as the vote counters, but it happens in the court system and the like. The reinvigorating democracy piece, I think, is both practical, like we need to be providing people assistance on things like countering propaganda and disinformation. I mean, if we think disinformation is damaging to American democracy, this stuff is happening in a lot of these countries. We see that. We see how that influence operations are occurring there to sort of steer the currents, and not to mention the proven instances where you have these transnational criminal groups that are pouring millions of dollars into political campaigns in these countries. So how do we address those parts? What institutions beyond the summit can we use to address those challenges? I'll start with you, Ms. Chavez, because I think you've talked about this. What other institutions and measures can we use at the summit and post-summit to address things like disinformation, the financing of campaigns by criminal groups who have, drug dealers or whatever that have millions of dollars that they can invest in some of these campaigns? How do we elevate that issue and make it not just a topic at the summit, but after the summit?
Thank you for the question. You make an excellent point about democracy in general, that there are cases, increasing number of cases, not just in Latin America, but across the globe, where you have a leader that's democratically elected, and then we see that later in a very deliberate manner dismantling democratic institutions, whether it be the autonomy of the courts. And we have examples, like, as you allude to, in our own hemisphere where that's happening. So one of the recommendations, I think, and this would be part of reinvigorating the OAS. Well, first of all, I really I have to express my gratitude, too, for the upholding the Inter-American Democratic Charter Act, which I think is an important statement about the importance of this charter. But one of the things I think the hemisphere could do a better job of is calling out these deliberate assaults on particular institutions and not wait until, there's this race to the bottom, not wait until it's just a shell of democracy is left. So I think that's one of the things, is to look at these steps that are taken along the way. And we're seeing this, for example, in El Salvador. I think that when it comes, another big issue in our hemisphere, and we see it in particular in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, is violations of human rights. And I think that in the case of Venezuela, the UN's role with its mission to Venezuela, where it actually went in and then reported on crimes against humanity, is another way. I mean, that is not a hemispheric organization, it's the United Nations, but I think that is also incredibly important. As far as disinformation is concerned, I think this is an issue for our own democracy as well. I think, as I've said, I think that that we need a more holistic strategy. This should be part of that strategy. But it's my understanding that the administration is devoting resources to countering disinformation in the region, whether it be in the lead up to the Colombian elections, whether it be Russian disinformation in Mexico, because as you allude to, it's a real problem, again, across the Americas, across the hemisphere.
Can I go on? Or just, I'm not going to take much longer, but Mr. Farnsworth, I wanted to just touch. So I'm thinking back to like the importance, the symbolic but also practical importance of who do you invite to a summit. Because a lot of times people say, they hear me talk about, don't invite Cuba. They say, oh, he's just a guy from Miami, Cuban-American. These guys are they want us to be stuck in the 1960s, and it's all about blocking Cuba for political purposes. There's a practical implication to it, and I'll tell you, let me describe it. So in July of last year, you have basically apolitical people, right? I'm talking about like poets and artists and songwriters and things of that nature that are like, okay, so we're in Cuba, we want to be able to express ourselves. And when I mean express ourselves politically, their expressions are not necessarily things about like how government should be structured. They have complaints about like economic performance and opportunity, or why aren't we allowed to? Why do we have to run our songs and their lyrics through a government censor? So they protest against these sorts of things. The government cracks down brutally, literally pulling children out of their homes and putting them in jail. In fact, the regime in Cuba just criminalized criticism of government officials, right? Not protest alone, criticism, just the act of criticizing them can wind up in jail. So all this is happening. So you're one of these people, you're standing up against that. I think for the first time in modern memory, you have a real amount of unity. You have the Latin Grammys talking about this. You have people across the board sort of uniting behind this from the perspective of being against it. And then you read or hear that potentially Cuba, that regime, just 2 weeks removed from criminalizing criticism, less than a year removed from a brutal crackdown at the street level, is going to be invited to the summit. And I don't know if people fully understand how demoralizing that is, because the way the regime uses that against its opponents, and internally, among people internally that might be thinking, hey, we're getting isolated, maybe it's going to be time for a change once all the old dudes die off, or sooner, they start thinking to themselves, the regime says to them, you see, the world doesn't really care. At the end of the day, we have the power. They have to work through us. In the end, they're going to cut a deal with us, and the evidence of it is they invited us to a summit. I would say the same thing about Maduro, and that's the argument Maduro is using around his inner circle. It's not that the inner circle in Venezuela thinks Maduro is, some great historic figure. It's that they're corrupt. They've made millions of dollars off that corruption, and right now they're better off with him there than without him. That may change in the future, but and the argument he makes to them is, I'm the guy that can get this thing right again. I'm the one that America's now beginning to talk to and deal with. So I think that's the practical implications of that sort of thing. And by the way, it just completely demoralizes and discredits those who are standing up and opposing those movements. And that's why I ask about these invitations, because I think I would rather have a summit with 15 countries that are democracy than with 25 countries and 5 or 6 of them are just blatant anti-democratic regimes, because then it's not a summit of democracies. It's a summit of whoever's in power in these individual countries. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about both the symbolic and practical impact it has when you elevate regimes like this to that status.
Thank you, sir. I think your points are very well made and very important. The Summit of the Americas from the beginning, from its inception in Miami, has been different. It has been intentionally a meeting of democratically elected leaders, to the point where the hemisphere itself in Quebec City in 2001 created the expectation that for all future summits, only democratically elected leaders would be included. And that expectation was actually memorialized in the Inter-American Democratic Charter that was signed in Lima, Peru on 9/11. Secretary Powell delayed his return to the United States as terrorists were attacking the United States to sign the Inter-American Democratic Charter because it was that important. And that's the basis of the decision here. It's not a U.S. determination about, political this or that. The hemisphere itself decided that non-democratically elected leaders should not have access to this crown jewel of inter-American relations. There are other fora, there are other opportunities for discussion. Okay, fine, you can have that discussion in the context of other vehicles, but the Summit of the Americas has expressly been reserved for democratically elected leaders. And so at some level, this really isn't even a decision for the United States to make because it was a hemispheric decision. And by the way, that document was signed by no less than Hugo Chavez himself. So, you know, there's a lot of support here, or there was at least at the time. But I think your point about platforming dictators is critically important, particularly now. You've had the protests from July in Cuba less than a year ago. You just had the passage of a draconian penal code to then turn around and invite a representative of the Cuban regime to a democratic summit of other leaders, frankly rewards that type of behavior, and your word demoralizes, I think, is appropriate in this context. It's also been interesting to me and concerning, frankly, that some countries in the region, some leaders in the region, have chosen to make this essentially a cause célèbre issue in terms of their own participation. You know, it seems to me that coming out of COVID, where economies have been crashing, where recovery is not guaranteed, where Ukraine's wheat and agriculture products are not guaranteed for global markets, where energy prices are spiking, where debt increases, loads are increasing, which are now more difficult to service because of increasing you know, the expense of the dollar, as well as rising U.S. interest rates. I mean, look, there are lots of things to be discussing at the Summit of the Americas. Is the most important hemispheric issue whether Nicolas Maduro, who is being investigated by the International Court of Justice, should be included? To me, that's a non-issue. The answer is no. Let's talk about economic recovery. The answer is no. Let's find a way to create jobs in the region so that migrants aren't tempted to try to come to the United States because our economy is growing and regional economies are not growing. There's a whole discussion here waiting to be had, desperate to be had, with democratically elected leaders from the region, and yet the conversation has been hijacked by people who are trying to undermine the interests of the United States to promote their own interests in some cases in the region. That to me is incredibly disheartening because if you put that again against what we saw in Miami in 1994, it was a totally different scenario. In 1994, it was the United States was being pushed, actually, to commit to a free trade area of the Americas. The United States was being pushed in order to have an ambitious agenda. It was Venezuela that insisted that energy be a part of the Summit of the Americas agenda in 1994. Again, I was there, so I'm speaking from personal knowledge. But the way that the hemisphere has shifted in that discussion over the last generation has been something very important to see. If I can extend just for another 30 seconds, I know that I'm talking way too much, I apologize. But the question about some of the tools that we have to address these, I think, is also a critically important issue. And from my perspective, the United States has not done a very good job either using the tools that we have available to address democratic backsliding in the hemisphere, nor have we updated our toolbox. And let me explain. The toolbox has changed. Social media didn't exist in 1994. There was no Telesur in 1994. There was no Russia Today propagandizing in Spanish throughout the region in 1994. And yet the United States has not updated our toolbox. Why does Nicolas Maduro have access to Twitter with over 4 million followers, many of them probably bots? Sure, but that's a US platform subject to US laws. You know, these are the types of things I think we have to have hard conversations around, because the ability to reach citizens and communities outside of the countries is frankly the ability to propagandize and spread an anti-democratic message and many times an anti-American message. I think we have to take a look at that. I think the OAS has traditionally had some troubles. But I do want to give a shout out to the Secretary General, Luis Almagro, who I believe is a real champion for democracy and has stood for democracy even when many of his member states have not supported him in that effort. There are other things to say, but the point is I think you're definitely on the right track. Thank you for the—
Well, I'm going to wrap my portion of this just to say I think the point you've made about prioritization is really important. Like, given all the challenges the region is facing across the board, to have some of these folks sort of make this issue the primary issue that they're hinging the entire summit on, I think shows you a lot about the political interest behind some of this. I also think, by the way, that, I mean, what many, Obrador as an example, hide behind is sort of a tradition in Mexican politics, particular to him as well, about non-interference, which is an easy thing to hide behind, except that you may say that your position is non-interference, but these countries are practically interfering in the affairs of other states. As an example, in Venezuela, they've created a migratory crisis through their policies that's been a huge burden on Colombia and other countries that have had to face that wave of migration. They've invited Iran into the hemisphere in ways that I think are potentially destabilizing in the long term. They're openly hosting and protecting narco-trafficking groups that operate from Venezuelan territory to conduct attacks inside of the territory of Colombia. That's interference, I think. I had the pretty clear interference. Then there's these grotesque violations of democratic norms. I don't know how we could possibly ever argue that Nicaragua has to be here. In Nicaragua, everybody who ran for president against Ortega went to jail. Everybody. Not like half the people or a couple of the leading candidates. If you filed to run for president, you wound up in jail, incommunicado from your family. I mean, that's a pretty outrageous anti-democratic move, is to say, I won an election because all my opponents are in jail because I put them there. That's what they've done. And that's the guy they're insisting that we invite, and his crazy wife. And to be a part of this was probably the real power, because he's borderline incoherent at this point, but she's even perhaps worse than he is, and he's pretty bad. So the last question I had is something we haven't talked a lot about, and it's not directly related to the summit, but I'd like to get both of your impressions on it, and that is Colombia. I think most of us remember a time where maybe 22, 24 years ago where there was real concern that Colombia was headed to failed state status. I mean, you had these cartels that basically in many cases held the governments there hostage over extradition treaties, bombings, and things that were occurring. And I think one of the great successes of American engagement in the region is our engagement with Colombia, to the point where not only did Colombia become sort of a very stable place with its issues, like we have issues and everybody else has issues, but became a force multiplier. In essence, what the Colombians learned from us, they've been able to take to Honduras and train their forces as an example there on how to combat these irregular groups and so forth. And so I'm always concerned about if ever there was a change in Colombia, and I know they have a presidential election coming up and they'll have to make those decisions, and a lot of this stuff that we do with them has been institutionalized, so you hope that that will survive political changes no matter what direction they take. But I was hoping to get the input of both of you of what would happen to our interests, not to mention to the stability of the region, if Colombia were to be lost to a direction that looks more like the instability we've seen or worse in places like Venezuela. What would that mean for democracy, for security, and for our national interests in the region?
Rebecca served in the Pentagon, so I wanted to offer her the first opportunity, but she says she'll defer. I think it's foundational. Look, the U.S. relationship with Colombia is strategic at this point. It's foundational to our ability to advance democratic and security interests throughout the hemisphere, not just in Colombia. And to have that undermined would be, in my personal view, a real setback, not just for U.S. interests, but for democracies in the region. Colombia has also been a huge partner in trying to alleviate the humanitarian crisis that's right next door, engendered by Chavismo, right, in Venezuela. So if you have that bulwark in some way changed, the humanitarian crisis coming out of Venezuela could, by orders of magnitude, get even worse. But I do think Colombia is a target. Colombia has been a target for a long time, and it's definitely a target now in terms of interests that are not aligned with the United States or are not aligned with democracy in the hemisphere. Because if you can get a country like Colombia to change path and to pursue an anti-democratic path, and let me hasten to say, I'm not suggesting that what's going to come out of the elections will be anti-democratic. Who knows what's going to come out of the elections? I'm simply talking theoretically here. But this is a critically important country, and it's important for the Colombian people themselves first and foremost, but it's a strategic partner of the United States. And were that direction to shift, then I do think you would have a real setback for the United States, but also for other countries that have clearly depended on that force multiplier impact that you so clearly discussed. The other issue I would raise clearly is the fight against illegal narcotics, but I think my colleague here would be better positioned to discuss that.
Thank you for the question, and also for just pointing out the importance of our bilateral relationship with Colombia. As Eric referenced, during my time at the Pentagon, Colombia was our our closest partner, defense partner in the region, I would say. And it was a relationship that was incredibly important to both Colombia, but also to the United States. As far as the upcoming election goes, I think it's too early to say whether or not Colombia will be lost. It's possible that there will be a president who has a different set of policy priorities, but we do not know whether or not he's going to act in an undemocratic manner. And this is just also just a reminder when we're thinking about the summit, this isn't a summit of friends of the Americas. I think we're right to be concerned about assaults on democracy, but I don't think that the fact that a country doesn't agree with us is necessarily, I don't think it is something that we should be weighing in on. I would say that one of the core issues with Colombia, regardless who wins this next election, and I say this from someone with a DoD background, is that the response to, Colombia has undergone a horrific decades of conflict, and the military in Colombia has played a tremendous role. Without the military, the peace accord would not have been possible. But I think going forward in our relationship with Colombia, we need to be focusing more on the social recovery of the territory, not just the military recovery of the territory. And this is about establishing a state presence in the previously undergoverned parts of Colombia. And I think that is something we can work on with Colombia, no matter who wins. Is the military has gone in, secured territory, but now we need the other Colombian institutions to go in and establish a presence, show people and show the Colombians that they're there to stay. I think that is the only answer to the long-term conflict and instability in Colombia.
And just as a point of clarification, I by no means do I think that we should be excluding countries from the Summit of the Americas because they don't agree with us. Like, if you didn't vote with us at the UN, I don't think on whatever issue, Ukraine, that we should somehow exclude you from it. The argument I've made is if you're not a democracy, if you're an open, unapologetic dictatorship that puts presidential candidates that run against a dictator in jail, I don't think they should be invited to the Summit of the Americas. I mean, not people that disagree with us. I'm not arguing Mexico shouldn't be invited, and they certainly disagree with us on a bunch of issues. And in the case of Colombia, I think what's happening now there is a case in point for why democracy is so important. So Petro's running, and he's the leading candidate in some of the polling, and I would venture to guess that we probably aren't going to agree with him on some issues. But you see his public rhetoric is moderated. I don't know how he'll govern. Why, if it says his public rhetoric on some of these issues moderated? Because he's trying to win an election. He's trying to get people to vote for him. And his policies will also have to take that into account if he wants to be reelected, which is the great thing about democracy, and that is that leaders have to measure their policies by what the electorate may or may not reward. And that's why democracy is so critical, because it does, as long as there's a democracy, Colombia is going to be okay. They may elect someone we don't agree with, that we may not like every decision they make, but ultimately they'll have to govern themselves by the constraints of an electorate that will punish them and their party. If we don't have democracy, they can do whatever they want. And oftentimes that's what starts wars and creates crisis. And that really is the point that I wanted to drive. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And can I just say I'm in violent agreement with you and with Eric about the importance of, on the issue of invitations and participation. I fully understand why Maduro, Ortega, and Diaz-Canel are not invited. Well, I guess we don't know for sure, but I'm assuming that they're not invited. And just also a reminder that participation is a two-way street when it comes to attendance. Nicaragua has demonstrated that it doesn't want to be involved in hemispheric discussion. That it showed that the day it expelled OAS from its country. So I do agree on the issue of democracy.